Good evening and welcome to tonight's second On the Record Community Forum here at the UU congregation at Shelter Rock. I'm the Reverend Ned Wight, the interim senior minister here at the congregation, serving with the Reverend Jennifer Brower and the Reverend Natalie Fenimore. And I am honored to welcome you here tonight. The presentation tonight is on water. What would be more appropriate than it should be raining tonight? I don't know, I didn't plan that, but sometimes it just works out that way. Shelter Rock Forum is honored to provide a community platform for tonight's panel of distinguished thought leaders who stand in a long line of such provocative forum speakers as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, President Jimmy Carter, Margaret Mead, Ralph Nader, and Paul Krugman, a long list, so no pressure here at all. Tonight, we continue our series of community gatherings in partnership with Blank Slate Media, sponsored by Northwell Health, focusing on how local communities are doing here in Nassau County. Our focus tonight is water, the source and sustainer of all life. Our seventh Unitarian Universalist principle, and all of our principles are outlined in the back of your program tonight, affirms and promotes the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. That's certainly true of our environment, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink. We are happy to host tonight's conversation. Inside your program, you'll also find information about upcoming social justice events here at UUCSR. And just a word that the next Blank Slate Community Forum is set for Thursday, April 18th at 7:30 p.m. in this very room, with a focus on immigration. Speakers will be Lawrence Levy, Isma Chowdhury, and Patrick Young. And there's more information about that in your program. So finally, without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator for the evening, award-winning journalist and Blank Slate media publisher, Stephen Blank. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on this rainy evening. I'd like to start by introducing our panel. Now, there has been one change here. One of our guests, you may have been expecting Patty Wood. She took the admonition for Broadway actors to break a leg a little too literally and had an accident, and we hope it isn't broken, but we will find out. But filling in her place, and Patty called to recommend her replacement, Paul Granger, who is to my left, and Paul is the superintendent of the Port Washington Water District and the chairman of the Long Island Water Conference.
Legislative Committee.
Water what?
Legislative Committee.
Legislative
Yep.
Committee.
Yeah.
Late guess.
Yeah.
We have also to my right, we have Sarah Mayland, who's Director of Water Resources at the New York Institute of Technology. And to her right, we have Dorian Dale, the Director of Sustainability for Suffolk County. So I would like to thank everybody for attending for our panel. And I'd like to start the questioning off with Sarah to discuss what the situation of Long Island, where do we get our water, and what are the threats to the water system? Sarah?
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting me to participate. To summarize as quickly as possible what our situation is, we get all of our water from wells that pumps groundwater from beneath all of Long Island. We use no surface water at all, and surface water is water that's trapped on the surface like streams and lakes and reservoirs. And the water that's trapped below in aquifers is groundwater. So all of the drinking water and all the other water needs we have uses groundwater, and that requires us to pump the water out of the ground and then out to those who are going to use it. So we have a series of aquifer formations beneath all of Long Island. You can go anywhere on Long Island and dig a hole, and you eventually will hit groundwater. And this has been a very generous source of water since people started coming to Long Island and living here. But the situation is that in the past, Long Island groundwater was known as some of the purest water in the world. Exceedingly clean, crystal clear water. But now we have almost 3 million people living on the land above all of our water. And so over the past 50 years, which is the time that the current way we oversee our water supply was set up, we've had one story after another of issues that are related to the decline and loss in quality and quantity of that groundwater supply. It is not unlimited. It begins as rainfall. The rain falls on the land. Some of the rain trickles down through the dirt and keeps going until it hits the collected water in the aquifers beneath us. So from a problem standpoint, today we have a collection of some of the most significant issues around groundwater supply of any place in the United States. That wasn't the way it was 50 years ago. So this has been a progressive decline in quality of the water stored in the ground. Now that doesn't mean all the groundwater down there is affected. We still pump plenty of groundwater that is still very, very clean and drinkable. But the picture is progressively changing, so there's less of the pure, pristine water and more of the slightly degraded water in the aquifer system. And this is the challenge that we have today, to try to reverse that trend and put programs and strategies in place that will manage this resource in the way that it should be managed.
So, Paul, what are the threats to the water system? Because we're reading it seems that every week there is another threat that is reported in the press up to our water supply. What are the challenges that a water provider like you are providing and that you're working on from a legislative point of view?
Well, it's really staying ahead of the curve, and what's been in the papers as of late is these emerging compounds that we're dealing with, whether they be prefluorinated compounds, PFOA, PFOS, 1,4-dioxane. So the technology to detect emerging compounds and even current compounds at lower and lower levels is a big challenge, because the public is demanding, high quality water. And this is what's driving us to provide more advanced wellhead treatment. And in some cases, the detection and the of the contaminants is outpacing the treatment technology. Well, the good news with the prefluorinated compounds is that granular activated carbon handles that. But with 1,4-dioxane, which is a different type of chemical, requires some advanced treatment, which is our biggest challenge. And when you look at everything that you need in terms of treatment for your wells, it comes down to having funding. Whether you get your funding through grants, whether you get your funding through water rates, but the cost of water is going to increase as we have these challenges of increasing the quality of our water. And it's only because of what we do on Long Island, which Sarah pointed out. We have a sole source aquifer, so we live, work, and play on top of this aquifer. So whatever we do above eventually makes its way down into the aquifer system.
Is Long Island uniquely vulnerable to this? Because I think that there are 85 or 89 wells in New York State that were found to have unacceptable levels of 1,4-dioxane, and out of the 85 or 89, 82 were on Long Island. What is it about Long Island that makes it such a threat? And in addition to that, Long Island also is, I'm seeing, leads the state of New York. This is not something you want to lead the state of New York with Superfund sites, where you have chemicals that are leaching in there.
First, I just want to mention that all three of us, Paul, Sarah, and myself, sit on the Long Island Commission for Aquifer Protection, which is a joint commission that is drawn from both Suffolk County and Nassau. You may have noted I'm from Suffolk. We have some distinct issues, and specifically, we currently do not treat I say 75% of our homes are not treated their wastewater is not treated. So that is clearly a contributing factor in our realm. You know, the difference that we need to also understand is that the aquifer levels at which our water is drawn go down hundreds and hundreds of feet. And so there are different levels of groundwater that will take the various contaminants and move them in various kinds of directions. And so often when you do identify some of these contaminants, I know that we have a brownfield site that we're dealing with in the Kings Park section, for example. It's a 25-acre industrial site that just got tested for very significant levels of PFOAs. But they're down probably about 150, 200 feet, so it's really difficult to identify, frankly, where they've come from. So, you know, when you start looking at Long Island and how we've done business in the past, I mean, we had a very large industrial base, as we all well know. So we have the Grumman plume, and we have all sorts of other contributory factors from various other kinds of aeronautic and defense operations that have left large legacies. You know, we have tremendous legacies coming from the duck farms that we used to have out in Suffolk County, for example, that provide, you know, really put a lot of nitrogen into the systems. Some of them are, you know, a 50-year flow from, you know, points that then come into some of our watersheds and, you know, create all the algal blooms that you've seen and, excuse me, the anoxic conditions that kill fish and kill shellfish. You know, we know, for example, that we used to provide half the hard shell clams throughout the United States from the Great South Bay. That no longer is the case. So in addition to the contaminant, you know, emerging contaminants of concern that Paul has cited, we do have all these other legacy factors. And at the end of the day, I think we're going to have to probably prioritize how we respond to a lot of these circumstances, because we do, in fact, have many both contemporary and legacy contributory factors that we'll want to address, but we won't really be in a position to effectively finance. And that, at the end of the day, is really the challenge. Where are we going to draw the financial resources to address these massive and pervasive problems that you've enunciated? Now,
I saw recently that there was a story that now the price for addressing 1,4-dioxane was $840 million. This at a time when the state budget is being challenged. There's talk about delaying the implementation of this. The water providers are looking for more state aid. I guess, you know, one basic question is, how safe is the water that we are drinking on Long Island? What, you know, how much concern should people be having? 1,4-dioxane is a carcinogen. How big a threat is that to us?
When you look at 1,4-dioxane, I could speak in terms of my district and the other districts, where they have found, and in talking with my colleagues, where they found 1,4-dioxane at relatively high levels, they've taken action to remove the wells from service. But there are certainly wells in operation island-wide that have low levels of dioxane. Now, it just hasn't suddenly appeared. It's always been there. It's been commingled with these legacy plumes here. So what is new is the ability to detect detect these compounds. And now we're looking at, it's such a unique chemical that we have to come up with the right treatment technology solution. We're not there yet, believe it or not. And it's not that the water suppliers are trying to push this off or delay this. It's not like if we're dealing with a typical solvent that we've found for many, many years. That's relatively easy to treat. You do what you need to do in terms of coming up with the capital and constructing the system. What we're trying to be very careful with regard to 1,4-dioxane is avoid unintended consequences, because the reaction you need to remove the chemical involves a process called advanced oxidation. Simply you're using an oxidant like hydrogen peroxide, and you're using UV lamps in order to oxidize and break down this compound to something that's much safer. And then we use carbon at the back end to capture everything else. But it's a complicated chemical reaction. You think water's simple, and it is to a certain extent, but the chemistry in terms of getting it as pure as possible, we're not dealing with distilled water, is complicated and challenging. So we're recommending and working with the state that perhaps we go with a phased approach, because you want to mitigate exposure. So we're looking at not running away from the problem, but running into the problem, but doing it right, because as you mentioned, Steve, you're looking at over $800 million to invest, and you want to invest those dollars wisely. It's a lot of money.
So while the problem is being studied and other issues are out there, how safe is the water for people to be drinking it now? For people on Long Island, how safe is it? And if it's not safe, or there's a degree of risk here, what ought people be doing?
Well, we've had, and that's interesting. I get those questions. This story evolved, or the concern evolved, as the data came out. This was part of testing under the UCMR3 program. And I think a lot of the data came out back in 2016. So I had a lot of initial conversations with the residents we serve, concerned, rightfully so. And I put in the context that, we as suppliers, we live on Long Island, we drink the water, and we have a vested interest in making sure it's safe to drink. And we rely on our health professionals, the county and state health department, to kind of guide us. And when you're looking at, right now, with the Drinking Water Quality Council, which Sarah was on with me, came up with a recommendation of 1 part per billion for 1,4-dioxane. That represents a relatively low risk when you look at it in the context of risk. So the 0.35 part per billion advisory from EPA represents a 1 in a million risk in terms of cancer. And what does that mean when you look at 1 in a million? Well, you have a better chance of getting struck by lightning than having the possibility of having cancer. So it's a difficult conversation to have, but I always tell people from the context of, I live in Levittown, I work in Port Washington, there's dioxane in both systems and other systems, that I'm confident to drink the water. People ask, how can I filter it out? The problem is, because it's such an advanced cutting process here, there is no certified home filtration unit that can remove 1,4-dioxane. So you're really relying on the water suppliers working with the regulators and engineers to get to a solution here. But we shouldn't panic. We should just continue working forward to implement this treatment.
Sarah, would you like to comment on this issue?
Yes, I would. So just stepping back to your question, is the water safe to drink? There's not an easy yes or no answer to that question. In the past, the way the question would be answered would be to the public, well, your water meets all the standards, therefore it's deemed to be safe. Well, we can't say that anymore, because now we're finding chemicals that are not regulated, that do not have standards. We're just learning how to test for them, and we haven't taken the step of being able to regulate them. So we know they're in the water, we know that they have health consequences, and it isn't just one chemical, it's a number of chemicals, and more than likely that number is going to grow over time. Because we do know that when we look, we find. And so now that we're looking at a new class of chemicals, we're finding them. And we're finding them all over the United States, not just on Long Island. However, when you look around the United States, other states have been much more aggressive in dealing with these chemicals than New York State has. So the issue is, how can we be both persuasive to the public that the water is being taken care of properly, but knowing that there is more that needs to be done? And that's where we are right now. There is substantially more that needs to be done, not only with adopting the standards, but moving them into the regulatory arena as quickly as possible. And I think the water suppliers would appreciate it if the standard would go ahead and be adopted, so you knew how to proceed. You knew what you were working with. And we're not there yet. The other thing is, we cannot simply be throwing money at these problems, because we'll be in that situation forever if we don't try to get a grip on where are these chemicals coming from, which we think we know, and secondly, how can we stop them from getting in our water into the future? And that we haven't even tried yet. Our basic understanding for many of these chemicals are either they're coming from some kind of a spill, a waste discharge, either from industry or from homeowners or commercial operations. And so really, when you look at the big picture, what we're doing to our groundwater system now is we're treating it like a toilet. And no one wants to drink toilet water. And in Suffolk, this is literally what is going on, because there is so little public wastewater treatment actively going on in Suffolk. It's not the same here in Nassau, because 90% of Nassau is already centrally sewered, the wastewater is collected, and it's discharged offshore. But the fact that we're still living on top of our groundwater means that anything that we put back into the environment has a very high potential to get into the aquifer. And so our challenge is to start looking sooner for these chemicals that we suspect are a health risk or a contaminant, and stop them from getting into the environment. That means being stronger on our discharge programs. In New Hampshire, they started dealing with 1,4-dioxane in 2010 and required all of their discharges in the state that are regulated by state government to be monitored for these emerging chemicals. We haven't even thought about doing that here in New York. So there's a long way to go. We clearly want our drinking water to be the safest it can possibly be, and I think that's the goal we're working to reach.
Now, these chemicals are found, I think they're in shampoos, they're in detergents, they're in home care products.
That's the 1,4-dioxane.
This is
The 1,4-dioxane. So how is that being regulated? Because I understand 1,4-dioxane is not, one of the problems has been is the EPA is not classifying.
There's legislation before the legislature now in New York to ban 1,4-dioxane from consumer products.
So how much is a danger if people are shampooing, they're washing, products like that? How much of a threat? Is that something as a consumer, should I be avoiding products?
Yes.
Yes.
That contain that, and is that labeled clearly in
No,
the?
that's the problem.
How many
It's not
people in the
labeled.
room use Tide? Raise your hands.
Tide, washing detergent.
1,4-dioxane.
That's a good question.
A lot of
Significant source.
cosmetics
Yep.
have them, lotions, anything that sudses, shampoos and so forth, will have 1,4-dioxane as a constituent of some of the chemicals that are used to
And
manufacture.
of course, some to a greater degree than others.
You would like
Yeah,
to
but-
see the ban happen at the federal level because of interstate commerce.
Yeah, but that's not going to happen right now.
Yeah, so
We all
well,
know
at
that.
least start at the state.
So what's happening at the federal level?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Well,
Nothing.
and that's, we know what the deal is there, but
Right.
just getting into the, for example, as we're talking
We don't
about.
all know what the deal is. You guys may know.
Well,
but,
I think it
maybe-
looks like a pretty savvy group out here. So, but I mean, in terms of the PFOAs, the PFAS and PFAS, EPA still hasn't actually gotten a handle on what the concentration is. I mean, so one recommendation at this point is 70 parts per trillion, which clearly makes it more exacting in terms of that, that kind of parsing out than dioxane. But they're still developing what conceivably would be the protocols to address this. And in terms of the PFAS, you've probably read about all the fire retardants that were used out in Gabreski Airport, and that obliged the water authority to come in and actually take people off of private wells and put them onto public water. They did that very rapidly and they responded very effectively. But we're finding these particular contaminants all over, and the issue is, where are they emanating from? And that's very difficult to tell because of the hydrology and how these things move and what the various other contributory factors are.
So you basically have this one. I mean, the groundwater here is something that's fungible, that goes between, we've got one big aquifer under Long Island, so it can travel from a distance, no?
It doesn't work that way. Groundwater, mainly in Nassau County, stays in Nassau County. Groundwater in Suffolk basically stays in Suffolk. From the Long Island Expressway as an identification point, rain and groundwater falling north of the Long Island Expressway ends up moving toward Long Island Sound. Rain and groundwater that falls to the south of the Long Island Expressway moves to the South Shore in the Atlantic Ocean.
But it's not quite linear, so
It's not an exact line, but it's a
right.
good place to imagine a dividing line running from west to east that divides the Long Island in basically two halves. And the groundwater in each of those two halves works independently of one another. The groundwater is flowing from the center of the island out to the shoreline.
But by the way, just in terms of wastewater treatment, we do have, I think, significant areas on the North Shore here in Nassau. I believe something on the order of about 50,000 houses that have cesspool or septics. So that's that 15% you talked about that is not currently sewered.
All of them are
that would be an
lot.
issue for this area in effect. And the problem, again, when we get back to identifying the problems, we have infinite problems, but only finite resources. So just as a heads up, when D&B, which is an engineering firm, did a feasibility study for 5,400 homes in the northwest portion of Nassau, the per parcel cost of building the plant, putting out the pipes, the pump stations, and the connections. Does anybody want to venture, this is a 2-year-old feasibility study, how much per house that was going to cost? Anybody? Guess? Did you say 500,000? Wow. No, it was 120,000. So, they're in, I think, a very, elemental issue. And if you take 120 and you amortize it over the course of 20 years, add on the interest and so on and so forth, and then add that to your tax that you already think is too high, then you're suddenly going to be getting a real socket in the pocket. So, I think all of this conversation needs to ultimately be leavened by how you are actually going to address it in terms of funding. And the other thing, frankly, is that you're going to have to really do a loading order and prioritize in terms of what needs to be addressed, what actually presents the most existential threat, because you're not going to be able to address it all. I think you hit on that yourself a little while ago.
They were talking just 1,4-dioxane, that $800 million they're talking about is going to cause water bills to double just by the treatment of that. Is that, Paul, is that a correct number?
That's a fair assessment, and it'll hit each supplier a little differently, but it could have that potential.
But I think the average water bill in Nassau County is $850 a year, and that can...
Well, I guess if you aggregate all the suppliers, perhaps. My system would be less, and I think other municipal systems would be less than that figure.
Okay. Now, in terms of the handling, you're on council that is what is sort of is there a working body? I know that in some locales there is a body that exists to address water issues. That is a separate department that takes place. Is there anything like that on Long Island? I think there's organizations that you're doing it, but is that something that is firmly established as a department? And if it's not, should there be?
The answer is no and yes.
Well, would you like to expand upon that a little bit?
Right now, there is no central groundwater management agency for Long Island.
Are there in other places?
Yes.
Okay.
In most other parts of the United States, there will be a designated agency to deal with a valuable local water resource. And that is its job, to manage that resource for the benefit of all. We don't have that on Long Island. Most of the rest of New York State does. But they have it for a surface water resource. And we have large regional agencies that are multi-state that manage the resource for all the users of that resource. It's usually built around a river system. So the Delaware River, the Susquehanna River, the St. Lawrence River, and the Great Lakes. They all have significant agencies designated to manage that resource, whatever that looks like. We on Long Island only have groundwater, and our groundwater is local. So we don't have the benefit of sharing it with others, but we also don't have the benefit of having others help us and manage this resource. And right now, we don't have anyone to manage our resource. And that's part of the problem, and that is also the way we can get to a real solution.
Well, we do have the New York State DEC Region 1 office right now, and they've been getting an increase in funding to address that very need. Granted, I agree with you in the past, they haven't had enough funding and it hasn't had enough attention. But I think with all of us being on LICAP, we've kind of pushed that along in terms of getting the funding for DEC to better manage.
Well, the DEC doesn't even have a hydrologist on staff. One hydrologist. What? Department of Environmental Conservation, which is the state agency that has the mandate to oversee and protect our groundwater supply.
What would be the solution in terms of an organization? You're talking about these different organizations. What would it be, and why hasn't one been created for Long Island, given the fact that Long Island is having all these problems now?
Well, I'll take a shot at it.
We'll let you, this is for everyone up here that you can answer.
I'll throw out the first, and Sarah has her own idea, but I think we have an existing framework in place that needs to be adequately funded. So that would be the first charge there. And LICAP has been good in terms of bringing this to the conversation. Sarah has another plan, which I know she will talk about. But having a hydrogeologist is paramount. So you got to work in that framework, and also that funding needs to be sustained. It can't be you have it one year and not the next year. It has to be sustained. So that's one thing that Sarah and I do agree with, that whatever entity you have, whether it's the current framework with the New York State DEC or another framework, you have to have that continuous funding of money so that you can properly work with the agency to manage the resource.
What is the feedback you're getting from the state? Why isn't there that funding for something? There is a problem here.
You're at the mercy of the state budget.
But if this is a potentially serious health problem, has that not been conveyed to the folks up in Albany? Or down here? I think I see our state assemblyman here, Tony Durso.
It has been conveyed. And I think the nice part about LICAP is that it has brought all the stakeholders together and moving this whole process along in terms of what we need to do. But we still need a lot more work to be done.
Okay, my turn?
Yeah, go right ahead, Sarah.
Okay, so LICAP stands for the Long Island Commission on Aquifer Protection. And it was established a little over, about 5 years ago, not quite. And it had a list of mandates to provide services for Long Island in terms of protecting our groundwater supply. It was an advisory group only. And it is true that it's brought people together of various backgrounds and viewpoints. A large part of the composition is the water supply community. Paul represents them. And the water supplier view has been a predominant view in how LICAP has addressed its work. You should know, however, that LICAP is opposed to the regional management agency that I believe is necessary. So we can come up with good recommendations, but they're only still recommendations, and what I and others are advocating for is a regional management agency that has real authority, real enforcement ability, real management tools and powers that will fix the problem of the way we've handled our water supply in the past, the way permits are given, how much water is allowed to be taken from the aquifer, looking at where all the polluted sites are, how to clean them up more rapidly. You know, the list goes on and on and on. The issue is not so much funding. It wouldn't be that expensive to do an entity like this. And I mean on the level of about $3.50 per person per year. That's a far cry from the amount of money that Dorian is looking to generate to deal with the wastewater treatment issues in Suffolk County. So we've got a whole different magnitude of scale between what it would take to establish a regional groundwater management entity for Long Island, similar to the surface water management agencies in other parts of New York State. And this is where we are butting heads, if you want to look at it that way.
So Dorian, you're in charge of sustainability in Suffolk. So where
Right.
do you stand on this?
Well, it's quite evident that Suffolk's issues are quite distinct from Nassau's. But I will say that having served together with Professor Malin on LICAP, and in addition to Paul and the other water providers, you know, there was a contribution that the professor made on this very issue. It was an evaluation that she provided. I think in hypothetical terms, and certainly in terms of the way that she's articulated and presented it here, it does sound like a no-brainer. But I think the devil's in the details, and with all due respect, I never was really transported by the depth and details of what the professor did present. I think we are all aware that we have innumerable levels of government. We are very much divided. I keep saying in Suffolk we're balkanized. We have a balkanized water cycle where the water provider plays no role in how the water is treated once it's provided, for example. That's somewhat distinct to Nassau, but you do have comparable issues. I just think that when you start talking about introducing more layers of government, you really have to step back and I think take a very in-depth evaluation and do very comprehensive, really strategizing as to how that is actually going to be workable. Certainly the DEC does take exception when the professor says that they're kind of asleep at the wheel on this, and to some degree maybe they haven't been as good in the past as I think they have become under more recent times. I think certainly in Suffolk we are seeing a lot of very constructive roles being played by certain aspects of the DEC, specifically in terms of water resources. I think their marine resources are a little bit more problematic as far as we're concerned out in Suffolk. So there's still really shortcomings. But then at the end of the day, and I think the legislature might want to conceivably weigh in on this when we get to the back and forth, it is a heavy lift when you start I think introducing what conceivably could be a palliative for these circumstances, but it's really has a long distance to go from concept, which is where it is right now.
Let me we've been talking about 1,4-dioxane, which is a major issue, but we're reading a lot about plumes. Now, that is mainly from manufacturers in Lake Success, nearby here at 1111 Marcus Avenue. I think Lockheed has taken over for a Unisys site, which was a military manufacturer. and there's a plume now, and they're monitoring wells. We've been reading about Grumman and Bethpage. How big a problem, and what are those substances? Those are things that were made in the manufacturing process. They're also containing carcinogens. How are they being handled?
Well, I can talk from the water supply perspective, and we have a good handle of that in terms of the treatment technology. So we either use granular activated carbon, or we use an air stripping treatment technology that's been used since the 80s, and it's been very successful. It's expensive, don't get me wrong, but it's been successful in dealing with these plumes. The problem with the sins of the past are the industrial plumes, such as the Lockheed Martin plume, the Grumman Navy plume, is that these plumes, in some cases, were never very well defined, so you're getting hit with waves of contamination, meaning, thankfully, we're staying ahead of the curve with continuous testing, and as you start seeing levels increase, then you have to upgrade your treatment facilities, and that's what's happening in Bethpage. They're like, no pun intended, in a war zone because of that Navy Grumman plume, and that was a result of manufacturing from World War II, which was important to our victory then. But now we're paying for the sins of the past here. And I think what happened in the past was that these plumes weren't well delineated, well studied. And now we're studying them now, but that's after the horses left the barn, so to speak. So we're dealing with those challenges. And then you layer on top of that the emerging compounds, which has always been there, but now we're detecting. And now we've got to put another layer of treatment on. So we're dealing with it more in a reactive way. We like to see things more proactive, and that's probably where DEC could step up more, which they have of recently. But also, it's the responsible party. Lockheed Martin, I had some experience with them. They are a responsible party that is working very closely with the water suppliers and cooperatively. Whereas with Grumman Navy, and I've been personally involved in that plume in my prior experience as a consultant, that the polluter is dragging their feet, and time is of the essence because groundwater, like Sarah pointed out, moves in a certain direction. Over time, it will spread out, and these contaminants will spread out.
But also to add to that, I mean, the PFOAs have been generally assigned to many of the aeronautical and defense contractors, and of course, we only became recently aware of what they do, and you have a lot of subcons. We're dealing with a large contaminated site up near Port Jefferson that was left by Lawrence Aviation.
Right.
Again, these guys, I mean, that particular operator, owes tens of millions in back taxes to the EPA cleanup, et cetera. And really, at the end of the day, a lot of this has been just dumped onto the taxpayer. While I think that there's real merit in going after the deep pockets that are still around, there's a lot of little pockets that contributed to this who are nowhere to be found.
I mean, there are 250 Superfund sites on Long Island. That's more than anywhere else in the state of New York. And is there not federal? The Superfund was actually federal money. Is that money dried up, or?
No, that's not the way it worked. So there was a federal Superfund, and there are sites that are on the federal Superfund cleanup list. And then New York State passed its own Superfund law and created its own Superfund pot of cleanup money. So a site can be a federal site or a state site.
I see.
And usually the state and the federal government cooperate so that one or the other is responsible for any site. But the real story is that it has taken so long to address the sites, first discover that they are there, then organize a strategy for cleaning them up. And just between those 2 points, discovering the site and getting to the point where you're ready to clean up, could take 20 years. 20 years just to get to the point of cleaning up.
That's fast.
And then and that's fast, yeah. And then cleaning it up could be 20 more years or 50 years. The Bethpage site, if they wanted to clean up the whole site, they're looking at over 100 years of remediation. And part of the problem now with the Bethpage site is whether they try to go for the whole 4 4-mile-long plume, or just try to intercept and clean up the very worst spots. When we take that water out to clean it, we don't know what to do with all of that water. So the original proposal was to dump it in the ocean. The pumping for that proposal was 10% of all the water pumped in Nassau County. Now they're trying to take a second look to reduce the scope of the cleanup, but they still can't figure out what to do with the cleaned water. And obviously everyone here is saying, well, put it back into the ground, which is a natural thing and appropriate thing to do, but they haven't figured out how to do that yet. And that's just for one site. And so the story of Superfund sites and industrial contaminated sites and gasoline spills and leaking underground storage tanks and dry cleaners that spilled their chemicals, this is what makes up all of the contaminated sites in Nassau and Suffolk County, and it's a huge list. And this is what comes when we live on top of our water supply.
One final question that I have is, this is water that people drink, people bathe in it, people are washing their dishes in it, they're cooking with this water, they grow crops on Long Island with this. What should people be doing, given the fact that there are so many of these problems? I, as a consumer, I, as a resident of Long Island living here, what steps should I take to protect myself and my family from these chemicals?
First and foremost, contact your local water supplier. We have our annual drinking water quality report available online, and if you can't find it online, call your water supplier. Educate yourself in terms of what's in your water. It's very transparent, it's out there. So you can be the judge. Obviously, reach out to the local county health department or the state health department, particularly if you have questions not only with the existing contaminants, but with emerging contaminants. The state health department, we had meetings with them recently because we said, while we have the burden of providing wellhead treatment, we also have to work with the public in terms of educating them, reaching out to them. And it's the health department's function to educate the public in terms of what does it mean with regard to exposure to certain contaminants. And they're working on a communication piece, particularly with 1,4-dioxane and the perfluorinated compounds. You know, you want to put things in perspective. Right now, we're 1,4-dioxane is going to be regulated perhaps at about 1 part per billion. That represents 1 second in 32 years. The perfluorinated compounds, PFOA and PFOS, 1 part per trillion. That's 1 second in 32,000 years. So we're dealing with very, very small numbers here in terms of what we're trying to remove from the water. So it just, once again, the best thing you could do is educate yourself in terms of what's in your supply, ask questions of the health professionals, and then take appropriate action.
Any advice,
I do.
Sarah?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at this. One is how to protect yourself personally, and also what is your obligation to the larger community of Long Island. And so there are two aspects. You can do things on a personal level to avoid certain products that have chemicals that you don't want to be exposed to. Conventional pollutants, as we term them today, the water suppliers have a history and a track record of dealing with them. And where there are standards, they keep the levels below the standards as they're required to do. But there are these new category of chemicals that are in the water supplies now, not universally. Not every water supplier has all of these chemicals in them, but many do. And so in this regard, everything we can do as consumers to not purchase products that have these toxic chemicals and various types of chemicals in them. We shouldn't purchase them. We should not throw them back into the environment. And encourage our regulatory agencies to be stronger. control emissions or releases of these chemicals that go back into the environment under some kind of state permit. Those permits need to be strengthened and severely enforced. And that will prevent these chemicals from getting back into our water supply.
Dorian, you want to add anything
Yeah, I
to
think that this is all sage advice from both Paul and Sarah, but I would also counsel folks to not panic, because I think that our health departments would tell you that your water is pretty good, but yes, you need to be alert to some of the really concerning factors that are occurring and that we're becoming increasingly informed of. And from the standpoint of individual measures, I mean, I always like to, and I've noticed in the room most people are about my age, and so we're probably talking about doing things for our children or our grandchildren, but I always like to say, do it for yourself so it will be done for your children and your grandchildren. And given the level of awareness that a finite group of people have, is not going to really move the dial that much. So clearly there's a very concerted effort in front of us, both in terms of understanding what the nature of the problems are, but frankly, figuring out solutions. Sarah has offered one. I think even though she's suggesting that my solutions for Suffolk are a little bit more costly than hers, it does get back to the premise. And just to put it in context, by the way, our water, although there are a few exceptions, and Sarah pointed out Hicksville, the Water Authority provides water to something like 400,000 households, I believe, in Suffolk County, and they only charge $1.87 for 1,000 gallons. Now, that is approximately maybe 1/2 to 1/3 the average of what Nassau residents pay. Maybe at a blended rate it'll be somewhat lower, but New York City, it's $5.25, and they have wastewater treatment thrown on top of that. So at least what we know in Suffolk is that we pay too little both for the consumption of our water, and we pay virtually nothing, except for certain areas, since 25% is sewered, virtually nothing to treat that water. And that means that certainly in our case, the idea that you have what we would call in Suffolk County an aquifer protection fee that takes that $1.87 and brings it to $2.87 and only costs households something like $95 a year extra, which I think is perfectly, digestible for water quality, certainly. That's another element of what people have to get accustomed to. Everybody complains about the fact that their taxes are too high and they pay too much for this, that, and the other, but, disconnect them from the internet, which is costing them several $100s a week, and suddenly, there's a hue and cry. Talk about $100 for water quality, and it's, wait a second. So a lot of it then, it really is a matter of stepping up and facing the fact that, yes, we're hearing about these problems, but what are the solutions?
Okay, well, thank you. Now we're going to open it. I've had the pleasure of asking questions for 45 minutes, and now we're turning it over to you in the audience. So anyone has a question, come on up and ask.
Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was interesting. But I noticed in the talk that we can look at Nassau and Suffolk, and that's great. We live in Nassau and Suffolk. But Long Island is not a political entity. Long Island is a geographic entity. And my question is, no matter what we do, if we don't do it in concert with Queens and Kings, what difference does it make? Or do we work with them? Is there something that says that we are going to do something and the city's going to do it also? Or are we just shoveling against each other?
Okay. Great question. The reason that we talk about Long Island as an entity and not include Brooklyn and Queens is from a water standpoint, we don't use the same source of water. So Brooklyn, all the 5 boroughs of New York City use surface water that comes from upstate or from Westchester County. That's it. So their water source area is 100 miles outside of New York City, and it has the highest level of protection that we know how to provide for a surface water system. Long Island, on the other hand, gets all of its water locally from right beneath our feet. So even though there are wells in Queens that the city has used in the past, may use in the future, the reason we're focused on Nassau and Suffolk is that our problems are immediately here in front of us. We'd be happy to work with the city on areas of mutual interest and need, but for right now, we're focused on what is critical for us. And it doesn't preclude that at some other point, we won't need and wish to work with the city on future issues and problems.
Paul, did you want to address the one issue of concern relative to Queens drawing water out of Nassau?
Yeah, New York City has a proposal to reactivate or re-permit their Queens well. So the water supply systems in Nassau County expressed great concern with regard to what it would do with regard to changing the elevation of the groundwater table, meaning will it cause saltwater intrusion, will it cause all other problems. So that's still an ongoing issue that's on the table right now. So to be continued, as they say.
Okay.
So I'd like to ask about sustainability and smart...
Why don't we introduce ourselves, give our name and where we're from?
I'm Karen Rubin. I'm a columnist with Blank Slate.
I knew the answer.
And he didn't do that.
I'd like to ask, since your sustainability, and I'm looking at smart growth, and I'm looking at Suffolk basically being at the beginning of the sewage treatment issue, that I've been to seminars, and I'm not going to express it clearly enough because the notes are not all in my head, but there are ways of introducing sewage treatment where it's also part of the energy solution, it's also part of the water solution, it's where the water can be repurposed for things like golf course irrigation and things like that, so that when you talk about the finances, my question is, there are ways, aren't there, of kind of balancing these things out, especially since you're starting from scratch. And also using water in a different way. And the second question I have is...
One to a customer, Karen.
What?
One to a customer.
So it's related.
Okay.
I'm looking at
Part two.
the smart growth of it. So you say we depend on aquifer, but why don't we have a way of collecting surface water like they do in Bermuda, where there is no aquifer? All of their water comes from what comes out the sky. Their roofs are constructed so that it purifies the water on the way down. Why don't we do other things?
Okay.
You first.
Well, I think the latter suggestion is excellent, and I remember going to Bermuda back in '57 and taking note of that. But as far as sustainability, and I'm glad you did point the fact out that I'm not a water specialist like my two colleagues up here. It's just one aspect of what I do in totality. So, for example, I'm also on the Pine Barrens Commission, and we have preserved an immense amount of open space out in Suffolk County over the course of the last 25 years, which in turn means no development, which means no contamination of the aquifer directly beneath the very extensive Pine Barrens. I also came from two sessions because I'm also on the aquaculture lease board, and we're reviewing a 10-year program that we've had in place, and we're looking at the introduction or reintroduction of the robust shellfish operations that we used to have on Long Island, both in terms of clams and scallops and oysters. And I think a telling example of where you seemingly come up with an initiative that should be acceptable and embraced by everybody is reintroducing oysters to the Peconic. Well, hold on a second. As long as you do your reintroduction of the oysters around the corner from us in the next cove, but not in front of our yacht club, we're fine with that, because the oyster gear is going to, cause, issues for the boats that have navigated these waters for the last 100 years. And furthermore, that's been confirmed by the Magna Carta, just in case you're looking for an authority on that particular issue. And we know that bivalves are the best way to clean water. So what is then the issue? And people will tell you, well, I am very much in favor of aquaculture. However, and that's where you start running into the challenges, because one person's solution is another person's problem, and this then gets into the minutia of politics. I'm also on the Suffolk County Land Bank, which deals with contaminated sites that are generally tax delinquent, because guess what? The guys who contaminate their sites also are deadbeats as far as their taxes are concerned, and they leave properties behind that we can't even grieve because we don't hold title to it. So you're dealing with bad actors all over the place. You're talking about things that have happened in the past. I walked into a property we have in West Babylon, and the guys are operating a chop shop and throwing chemicals down the drain and oil and so on and so forth. So the bad guys are still out there, and they're still doing bad things, and you can go out and switch from Tide to Arm & Hammer or something like that, and all these other characters are going to neutralize you. And then when you get a lot of money from New York State like we did, based upon our argument that wetlands are being reduced by the nitrogen loading that's going into our bays, and you get this found money, and you go to 3 different areas in your community of Suffolk County, and you ask them to vote for it, either yay or nay on a referendum, isn't it interesting that the 2 more economically challenged communities, in this case Wyandanch and Mastic, vote 85 and 87% in favor, but the Tonier community in Great River says 56%, no thank you. We don't want to pay another $700 a year for treating wastewater. Why should we? 360,000 homeowners currently don't do it. Why are we in the forefront and are getting done for this kind of money? So, sustainability really embraces or intertwines or interacts with all sorts of factors. Being able to come out at the end of it a little bit further down the road on the positive side is hugely challenging, but that's what sustainability really gets to. It's trying to not get a perfect solution, but the best that conceivably is available to you.
Okay, why don't we move to our next questioner?
Hi, thanks for telling us a lot about our water.
And your name?
My name is Cindy Suarez. I happen to live in a water district where I don't have municipal water. And so I'm surprised when I hear you talk about the low prices people are paying for municipal water. We pay more than $9 per 1,000 gallons. So my question is, what's going to happen to us, the people without public water, when we need to treat our water? And secondly, is there any way, our water is, more than half of our bills are taxes. Is there any way to capture that money and put it back into the quality of our water system or management, rather than just put it into the general tax coffers and have us paying 5 times what
Where are
everybody
you
else
from?
pays? Glen Head.
Glen Head? Okay.
Well, whether it be a publicly owned system or a privately owned system, they're obligated to meet water quality standards. So, for example,
I know they're obligated, but
Yeah.
if we need a treatment facility, what's going to happen to us? You're talking about prices of all the public facilities getting together and treating the water. What's going to happen to the tiny districts that do not have public water?
Well, now you do have, it's the ownership. Your system is still deemed a public water supply, even though it's privately owned. So
They have a franchise and they're a public utility. They're a private profit-making corporation.
right, I really can't comment on their operations other than
They're private.
You're asking with regard
But
to the quality of the
Who's
water.
going to pay then if we need our water treated?
I would throw that back. It ultimately goes back to the ratepayer, whether you are.
Back to the ratepayer.
Yeah, that's where it would go.
It's tremendously unfair.
My name is Mindy Germain. I am the lead organizer of the Western Nassau County Aquifer Committee, and I am a commissioner of the Port Washington Water District. And my question follows a comment, and the comment is, everyone in this room should realize from everything we heard tonight that the world has changed in how we manage our water supply. Everyone has a role. This is not about this agency or that agency. We are all in it together. And while we're talking about conservation, and we're talking about the fact that we live on a peninsula and saltwater is encroaching on us, so we have to cut back. I've been working with almost everybody up here for over 10 years trying to enforce conservation based on data and science. Well, now guess what? We're going to have to do it anyway, because when we're fixing those wells to treat 1,4-dioxane, we're going to have less supply, and so we're going to all need to cut back. So everyone should be aware part of our role as consumers is going to be conservation. And so my question to the panel, to help water suppliers and everyone who's advocating on this issue, what can people do this summer? And what should people be thinking about this summer in terms of their own properties, in terms of talking to their friends, in terms of talking to their children? What can we do about the concept of conservation?
So you should know, first of all, that every water supplier on Long Island has had the DEC direct them to lower their pumpage for the summer by 15%. That means everyone in the room who has public water, you have a role to play in reducing that for your water supply community and for the counties in whole. So that means, obviously, the big problem in summer water use is outdoor water use. Filling the pool, watering the garden and the lawn and everything like that. Those are the places where we need to use less water. And everyone needs to be more conscious of it. And let me just say, the place to start is to look at your water bill, look at not only how much your rate is, not only what your water bill is, but look at how much water that represents. If you can't say what you paid and how much water that is, you don't know what you're doing with your water. You have to connect those two, what you paid and how much water you bought for that amount of money, and then see if you can bring that down through positive measures. Water less frequently, put in irrigation sensors into your system, which are now mandated by law in Nassau County, and do all the things that you would normally do if water were a precious commodity, a limited commodity, which in fact it is.
So part of that also is conceivably, and since Patty Wood is not here, I'll pinch hit for her on this issue, and that would be conceivably getting away from these lovely green turfs that everybody is so fond of, that they think is emblematic of living in the burbs, and going to native species that require less irrigation. You asked the question before about beneficial reuse, and out on a golf course in Riverhead, we actually have recharge from a local sewer plant onto a golf course. It's expensive though, so that's not cheap. The other thing we're doing, since, as I've suggested, we have 360,000 homes to get on alternative treatment systems, is moving with smaller systems that are on-site systems and not sewers, because sewers is frankly too expensive for most places. And the beauty there is that there, in addition to treating the water, there's something called a shallow, narrow drain field, which then dispenses the water that's had a preliminary treatment, and that in turn fertilizes your lawn. So that $300 to $400 per annum expense that you put out for fertilizer, you can do with your own urine. So that's, I think, something that people might want to conceive of, particularly the 50,000 houses out here in Nassau that haven't gone ahead with that.
Okay. Sarah?
My name is Eric Weltman, and I'm an organizer with Food and Water Watch. And first, I want to say I'm thrilled to see that you do not have plastic bottles of water sitting beside you. So I'll applaud that.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, Food and Water Watch has been advocating for boosting state and federal funding for replacing lead lines and improving other infrastructure, water infrastructure. I was hoping you folks could comment on the precipitous decline in federal funding for water infrastructure starting as way back as the mid-'70s.
Well, that is a big problem. Our infrastructure is aging, and what's interesting, and we can talk in terms of New York State, American Society of Civil Engineers has put a price tag, not including these emerging compounds, that we need to invest in order to upgrade our infrastructure, $38 billion over the next 20 years. Factor in now the emerging contaminants, that number goes up to at least over $40 billion. And it's a shame, and we've been advocating. I'm a member of the American Water Works Association. Now I'm on the board of directors. So from a federal level, we're advocating that it's very important, because what separates us from third world countries? Our infrastructure, our water. When I travel out of the country, you know, it makes you feel grateful in terms of the quality of the water we have here, because you go to these other countries, you go to South America, Central America, it's a different ballgame. And what we need to do is continue to message our federal legislators, congressmen, senators, that this is important, and it's got to be put back on the radar screen. And I know right now in the federal level, they keep on talking about infrastructure funding, but we don't see any action. So, well, thank you for being an advocate.
Yeah, well, I just want to quickly note we've been championing a bill called the Water Act that was introduced by Senator Sanders in his House as well. Right now, we have 7 co-sponsors of this bill from the House in New York, none of whom are from Long Island. So we need the Long Island legislators to get behind the Federal Water Act.
You could reach out to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to help you.
Well, we just, your timing is perfect. We have at the mic.
I don't have the solution for every problem was mentioned
We have
here tonight.
State
but I do the
Assemblyman
best
Tony
I can.
Durso.
Anyway, my question is direct to Paul. Paul, you mentioned sustainable funding from the state. You're aware that last year we built $2.5 billion what we label water project. And this year we're still negotiating because we have to have the budget in place by the 31st of the month, another $500 million. What do you consider sustainable, I'm serious, sustainable funding from the state annually?
Well, the DEC puts in their budget requests, and I think it's working with the regulatory agencies and really listening to them in terms of what their needs are, because that funding can vary from year to year depending upon what issues we're dealing with. So I think it starts with communicating with the agency to determine what the baseline funding is and where you need to go up to better manage the resource.
Could you put that in writing and send it to me, and I'll bring it up for debate soon we have this budget out of the way?
Absolutely.
For Long Island, what we know, Suffolk and Nassau, Long Island. Long Island is bigger than Suffolk and Nassau anyway. But for Long Island, annually, what do you think you need to sustain the projects underway, or you want to, begin?
Yeah, we do have some of those figures, and we'll continue the conversation with you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you very much. My name is Dr. Charles Bevington. I'm the chair of Long Island Sierra Club Long Island Group, and we just finished a little short film, asked the professor at Adelphi. I said, what are the 3 things that you could do? And basically said, stop using single-use plastics, stop using pesticides, and stop using fertilizers. Because a lot of what the VOCs, the compounds that we haven't even, diagnosed or found or you're treating yet are still in the ground. And we need an advocacy group. And I know Mr. Daly just mentioned about, going after deadbeats. We also need an entity that has a legal arm. And I want you to comment on how maybe LICAP or a management entity or however, the water authority, you're all balkanized. If you have a district-wide, aquifer-wide group, I think you'd be much better at going after people and also helping everybody. Thank you.
Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I'm all for a regional management agency that would have the legal enforcement power to go after polluters and to set stronger standards for chemicals getting back into the environment to start with. If we aren't going to start at the source of the problem and rely totally on taking these chemicals out of the water right before we put it in our glass, it's a very inefficient and ineffective way to protect public health. The quality of the environment should be valuable enough to us that we want to avoid contaminating the environment to start with. And every step we can take, and you mentioned some excellent ones, not use fertilizer in the way we use it now, not use plastics, get away from the disposable society that we have become, recycle things. We hardly even compost much here any longer. So, I think we talk about the green energy deal, the new green energy deal. We need a new environmental ethic that pervades all of us here on Long Island, and everybody does their part to make sure that the environment stays as clean as possible, and our water will benefit from that.
Hi, my name is Michael Vezzi.
And where are you from?
I'm from Mineola,
Okay.
and I'm mostly concerned about the distribution of the water. You get it out of the ground, it was excellent, but when you get to those storage tanks, and then it goes into the water main, it's from the water main to the house. Now, the water main is probably, at this time, is a steel pipe that is coated, right?
It's usually cast iron or ductile iron.
Cast
that has
iron.
a lining in some cases.
Okay, and then the pipe coming out is lead.
It all depends upon the system.
Yes, because a couple of months ago, the town of North Hempstead has received a grant from the state to remove all lead pipes. So I don't know where the lead pipe would be, but the lead pipe will be as the comes out of the sewer, because you have to make a P. It's very pliable, the letter P, going into the house, and then there's another lead pipe. My reference was to Newsday, February 10th, 2019. And that's page A14. Did an excellent drawing and to show where the lead pipes were. Now, who's going to be responsible to fix that? The homeowner?
Well,
And now that the lead pipe, let's retract. Sarah went back about 50 years. I'm going back about 80 years. Long Island was for summer homes. A lot of summer homes on the South Shore and on the North Shore. And they most likely use galvanized pipes, lead pipes, but now they're using soft copper and then copper pipes.
with regard to the concern with regard to lead piping in the distribution system, it's a function of the age and construction of your home. A lot of homes on Long Island, well, take where I live in Levittown, that was built after World War II, so the likelihood of lead being as a service line is rather low, but there's other areas, such as in Port Washington, where we have older homes where you could have full lead lines, or you could have lead goosenecks and things of that nature. Realizing that we do potentially have lead metals out there, water suppliers do perform corrosion control. And to validate how that corrosion control works, we do lead and copper testing every 3 years, and we sample homes that are sensitive or that could potentially have lead pipes, lead goosenecks, and we look at that based on a health department plan, because you have to look at the most sensitive receptors. I mean, being an old house that was built at a certain period, that would be a Tier 1 house. So you use that data to determine, are you successful with your corrosion control, and are you preventing lead from leaching out? But yes, the town of North Hempstead did receive some funding. If you as a homeowner who lives in the town of North Hempstead is aware, or you believe that you may have lead gooseneck or lead service, certainly reach out to your local water supplier, and then also we would work out a communication plan with the town to see how you could leverage the funds. Unfortunately, most instances, the consumer owns the service line, but it varies from water supply system to water supply system.
I see. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Because I know that the town of North Hempstead will get the money, which they have already approved, but the villages would not receive that money, so they have to request water treatment. They'll be doing more treatment to the water to help this, to help their system.
Yeah. Once again, I would contact your local water system to
Yes.
see how those funds could be leveraged
Because-
if you have such a concern.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Judy Epstein. I'm another columnist for Blank Slate. I have a pretty simple question. I want to appreciate everybody who spoke tonight, and I will confess a lot of it literally and figuratively is over my head, but I'm doing my best. So I'm one of those Tide detergent users, and so I guess I'll switch to Arm & Hammer. But my bigger question is, how do I know that this, it's dioxane, right? That this is in something? What do I look for on the label, and what do I look for on the replacement label?
There are different websites that have listed the names of chemicals that you should look for. Maybe Blank Slate Media would like to put that list in their paper someday. And it's not very
If you
long.
tell us the answer, it'll be in next week.
But I would suggest that if, with all due respect, that instead of going for the chemicals and like wearing your eyes out trying to figure out what's on your label, there are innumerable sources that will tell you the good stuff versus the bad
So
stuff.
brands.
So
get
just
mentioned.
Google it, and you're going to get your answers. Even if I think Blank provides it as an ancillary service.
So 750
We'll see.
words and I'm done, Steve.
The Environmental Working Group is an organization that has listed a lot of the chemical names that you should look for on products that will have 1,4-dioxane in.
Well, actually, Judy stole my question. Mary Ann Del Monte from Port Washington. My question was, where can I go? Where can all of us go to get a list of the products that we should not use? Because you brought up Tide, and some of us raised our hands. So I wanted to go. We could read the back, we could put our glasses on and read the ingredients, but I thought there might be a list somewhere.
There are out there, yes, there are.
And I think, as being a Port Washington resident, I think in your newsletter that you guys do, that I read every time you guys send it out, that would be something great to put in the newsletter.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Good idea.
So getting this at the source is, I think, maybe one of the challenges, because it's garbage in, garbage out, and you get up the food chain, and you really get to where the original junk is coming from, and that's where you conceivably want to limit it. But then again, you're going to hit the skids when you actually try to get these principles applied. There's been a fertilizer working group that Patty Wood, for example, was a member of, and again, I'm pitch hitting for her. And that also included Scott's. It included the professionals, the landscape guys, the golf course operators, and they all had, frankly, conflicting opinions as to how most effectively to approach it. Now, I've always kind of believed that if you simplify things and you do it at the source, that's probably the optimal way to approach it. But it's not necessarily, for example, in the case of fertilizer, that easy, because in places like Florida that have had algal blooms and other, sewage-related issues, like, for example, in the Tampa Bay area, they've actually gotten a formula from Scott's that has no nitrogen in it. Now, you start talking about that up here, and everybody who's professionally involved sees that as being problematic. And they can explain to you, actually, fairly compelling reasons why that is, in fact, the case. But at the end of the day, I think we live, for the most part, all of us, in a set-and-forget world. Give me something that's simple, that's already gotten the solution incorporated into it, and I'm ready to go with it. But again, getting to that place, which means really wending your way through all these countervailing stakeholders, is not an easy proposition.
Thank you very much. My name is Jane McPartland. I'm from Syosset. I have two questions. One is concerning Suffolk County. I volunteer at an organic farm in Suffolk County, and recently we looked into digging a well to have our own water. And we were told that there could be no guarantee that the water would be pure. That we could build a well today at the cost of several $1,000s, and the water could be contaminated tomorrow. So the decision was made by the board not to dig a well. However, I don't know about Nassau County, but in Suffolk County, there is no lower rate for farms. We will now have to pay the residential rate. And I think as far as encouraging open land and keeping farms, that it would be a good thing to have an agricultural rate. And my second question is there a way...
Well, the farmers certainly would agree with you. And we have a lot, the farmers would agree with you, and we certainly have a lot of them in Suffolk County.
Right.
Suffolk County, until the yogurt guys butted in upstate, was the #1 agricultural producing county in all of New York State.
Exactly. And to keep that, because so many people are selling their farms and developing them. The second question is there any way to know if we're taking more water out of the aquifer than can be sustained over time? Or because of the high volume of people living on Long Island now, are we depleting the aquifer? And is there any way to know about that?
Well, no, we do a comprehensive measurement of the water budget. I mentioned it actually before we came out here that, ironically enough, the water budget in Suffolk is higher now than it was pre-development 40 some odd years ago, despite the fact that we have a large sewage treatment plant that really flushes all of its treated water out into the ocean. We're still sitting fairly pretty in terms of actual supply, and part of that conceivably also can be owing to the fact that, guess what, ladies and gentlemen, we don't actually dump all of our treated wastewater like you do in Bay Park, either into embayments, but we actually shoot it back into the ground. So the positive side of not treating our wastewater is that we do recharge our aquifer. We have a gentleman in the audience who's a former classmate of mine, Mark Hopkinson, who represents, I think, some of the private sector approaches that conceivably will be providing solutions to how to really redress a lot of the treatment issues. And as we can see, even if we have water that is treated with carbon, we are still dealing with the issues that result after you've provided that water to your customers, because then it becomes compromised, and either it becomes treated or not so effectively treated and then dumped into embayments, which creates problems, as we've seen in Reynolds Channel, for example. But at some point, we're going to have to come up with, I think, more effective treatment solutions, because that in turn will mean less compromise to this sole source aquifer that we all stand on top of.
So if I could just answer your question. There is a study going on right now being funded by New York State for $6 million with the U.S. Geological Survey. And they are looking at the quality-quantity issue primarily and its relationship to saltwater intrusion. It is starting first in Nassau and in Queens. And so that part of the study is beginning right now. And then it will transition out into Suffolk County. And the specific question that it is raising is where are we in the balance between taking too much or the right amount of water out of the aquifer system, and how's the system responding to that? So we won't have the answer to that question for a few more years, but we're trying to get there. And Mindy Germain has been a leader in this whole effort.
And by the way, the good news is we have fundamentally flatlined in terms of population on Long Island for the last couple of decades. So we're still, frankly, dealing with the same number of people that we had 20 some odd years ago. Although a lot of those people seem to use a lot more water. We know, for example, that the Koch brothers have a 4-acre estate out in the Hamptons that for some bizarre reason uses 21 million gallons a year. How they do it, I don't know. But anyway.
Now we got 2 questions. Go ahead.
My name is Ed Olmsted. I'm from Farmingdale. I'm a member of Dr. Malin's Water for Long Island group. I'm also a citizen member of the Navy's Bethpage Grumman contamination problem. I received a report today from the Navy, and in the report it said that there were still 5 or 6 VOCs in, maybe there were 6 or 7 wells that still had high levels of VOCs. But of there's 126 wells, I believe, dug all together, but all of the wells had high levels of 1.4 dioxane. I think that's the major question of what are we going to do? Does anybody have any answers to that?
Well, I'm not as engaged with regard to that plume as I used to be, but the 1,4-dioxane, which you're talking about, are monitoring wells, and they're finding in the monitoring wells, and not to anybody's surprise. So that needs to be addressed. I believe that they will be upgrading their remediation systems to take care of that. How long it's going to take, I'm not sure, but
Is anyone working on it?
that I don't know. I'm not involved with that plume, so I couldn't answer that for you right now.
After what I saw today, I think that everybody should be concerned
You
about
mentioned you're a member of the Citizens Advisory Group, correct?
Restoration Advisory Board.
Well, I would reach out to the DEC, who's managing the plume, and ask them that question. They're the ones who can give you an answer to that question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Ed, you bring up one good point, which is the strategy right now for remediating the Bethpage site has been to remove the VOCs. And the 1,4-dioxane contamination has never been addressed as a remediation issue at Bethpage. And this really changes the whole picture for that site now. Because the traditional treatment won't work for that plume any longer. So the cost of remediating that site just went, out of into
I
the
did recently
stratosphere.
go to a meeting where the Navy is removing the earth where the contamination was at Site 1 at the Grumman's complex, and they're taking it to another state. Now it's going to be somebody else's problem with that. They're taking it to 3 states, I think, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and one other state.
Oh.
But they are working on, removing the where the contamination came from. But it's still, now it's already in the groundwater.
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be, in my lifetime, I won't see it resolved.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, you get the bat cleanup. That was a good question.
Thank you very much. Hi, Stephen and everybody. My name is Stephen Sipo. I'm a retired project manager and scientist from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I don't really have a question. I just want to put everything in terms of priority and funding. And the issue that we often have with the federal government are priorities, and that comes down to dollars. With respect to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, it's operating at below 1989 funding levels, significantly below, and at 1989 staffing levels. And that's a problem. The federal government, under both administrations, has not been keeping up with really environmental, what we call priorities. In my opinion, they are extreme critical priorities because they deal with health and welfare of everybody each and every day. But we take one example, the Superfund law, which had a taxing authority on the petrochemical industry, expired in 1990. That fund went bust in 1995, so the public basically has been paying for the Superfund, except for when the government wins cases against companies, those funds go to clean up. The politicians are really good at passing laws at the federal level, like, for example, well, look at any of the laws. Most chemicals are grandfathered. There's 167 million chemicals and inorganic compounds in the environment. We regulate literally dozens, and it comes down to funding and priorities. So that's really just about all I wanted to say. And the other thing, and I'll, excuse me, and that is with the cleanup of most groundwater plumes, we deal with air stripping, which is simply the transfer of chemicals from the groundwater to the air. I've always, even with EPA, I've always had a problem with just using air stripping. And it's a comment that, it goes into the air and we breathe it. That's air stripping. Unless you add something like a carbon treatment on the airstream to capture the volatile compounds when they come out of the water, it's going into the air for everybody to breathe.
Okay.
Thank
Well, I'll ask the final question just on the air stripping because they have been used in this area. So with wells in Roslyn and some of the areas where it's been there, is there a danger with the use of air strippers? Because Christopher Morley Park has an air stripper for wells that were in Roslyn. Is that an issue?
Well, Nassau County just, as of late, maybe over the past 5 years, has been requesting water suppliers provide information with regard to the use of the towers. So they're basically enforcing DEC regulations with regard to the emissions that come from air stripping towers.
Okay.
Well, the issue is that if a community is a non-attainment air quality community, then they have to be sensitive to adding more VOCs to the atmosphere because it promotes things like smog and other kinds of detrimental air quality conditions in the community. And so it goes from treating the water and making the water cleaner, but simultaneously making the air quality degraded as you transfer that chemical from the water and release it back into the atmosphere. So that's the issue.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, I want to I think we have an excellent panel that provided a lot of information. Thank you all for attending. I hope you'll provide your suggestions and your evaluation to us and join us inside for our reception.